Thousands of Syrians have lost their lives in the conflict between forces loyal to President Bashar al-Assad and fighters opposed to his rule. Now, with the introduction of chemical weapons and possible Western involvement, an end to the conflict still doesn't seem to be in sight. But how did it all start?
Syrian genocide is an ongoing issue. The Syrian Arab Republic has been degrading since the beginning of March 2011, and it continues to deteriorate today. According to the World Factbook, Syria is approximately 3/4 Sunni, but its government is predominantly Alawite, a Shia sect that makes up less than 15% of the population. The Genocide Watch reports that massacres and mass atrocities against pro-democracy protesters and the civilian population are being committed by Syrian security forces under the command of the al-Assad government. The Syrian government continues to call the Free Syrian Army a terrorist organization in order to justify its all-out war against the rebels and Sunni Muslim civilians. The Huffington Post reports that as of January 2015, the death toll has risen above 220,000 people. Tactics used by the government include forced starvation, chemical weapons, bombs, and torture in prisons. A lot of the genocide going on right now is based in the classic religious ideological battles of Sunni versus Shia, but in reality it is more political based, as it has come about as a result of the Syrian civil war. Safari montage video titled Genocide. Genocide is defined as the intentional massacre of people because they belong to a group. According to this definition, the events occurring in Syria can be called genocide. The Syrian government is killing and torturing people because they are believed to be a part of the rebel group attempting to overthrow the government. Now, some could argue that this is not genocide because not all of the people being killed identify as rebels, and some deaths have been accidental civilian deaths. But the fact that the government is targeting rebel soldiers and is killing people for that reason makes this genocide. This statement is supported by both the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and the Statute for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. The UN Convention provides us with another definition of genocide. Genocide is defined as intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. The example of Rwanda set the precedent that liability for genocide extends to those who planned, instigated, ordered, committed, or otherwise aided and abetted in the planning, preparation, or execution of one or more of the genocidal acts defined by the UN Convention. This means that yes, in fact, genocide is occurring in Syria, and even those who haven't gotten blood on their hands are still guilty. Article 25 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court states that one is guilty of incitement to genocide when one orders, solicits, or induces the commission of such a crime, in this context war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that crime, in fact, occurs or is attempted. In simple words, incitement to genocide occurs when someone encourages the action of genocide, and then that action is taken out on the encourager. In the case of Syria, there was no incitement to genocide. In reference to Syria, in a report released by the UN, Special Advisor Adama Dieng, a legal and human rights expert, once said, quote, "Reprisal attacks, hate speech, and incitement to violence against a particular community have, in the past, been precursors to serious and massive violations of human rights and international humanitarian law." End quote. However, these attacks and speeches never had the purpose of encouraging the horrific acts occurring today. The protesters' demands started with democratic reforms, release of political prisoners, more freedom, abolition of emergency law, and an end to corruption. They then shifted towards the call for the overthrowing of the Assad government. After the shift in focus of the protesters is when the Syrian army started a series of large-scale deadly military attacks on towns using tanks, infantry characters, and artillery. This led to hundreds of civilian deaths. Neither protester nor civilian asked for that, or encouraged it, meaning there is no incitement to genocide. The two main players in this situation would be the Syrian government and Syrian civil groups. The government of the state bears most of the responsibility for this genocide. As I explained earlier, the Syrian government is targeting pro-democracy protesters within the state. In their views, they don't bear all of the responsibility because they are merely protecting the state and preserving their already existing government. However, as they are the literal killers, they obviously hold a majority of the responsibility. The groups within the state, more specifically the pro-democracy protesters, should hold none of the responsibility. While the Syrian government might blame the victim, no one else should. We have already established that there is no incitement to genocide in this case, so the victim should not be held liable. A third major stakeholder would be international organizations. As stated by the Arabic news company Al Jazeera, when the conflict originally broke out, the Arab League, European Union, and United Nations were quick to condemn the Syrian government's violent response to the protests, and these organizations expressed support for the protesters' right to exercise free speech. Both the Arab League and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation suspended Syria's membership. None of these international organizations bear any responsibility for inciting or performing genocide, but they still might be a little responsible. All of these actions occurred right in the beginning of the conflict, and the conflict has been going on for over 4 years. Maybe what they've done wasn't enough, and maybe they need to do a little more.
So the first actor we've named responsible is Bashar al-Assad, who's the president of Syria. And really, the Syrian conflict has occurred as a result of his failure to recognize the right of his citizens to peacefully protest after the torture of 2 teenagers who painted revolutionary slogans on their school wall. And al-Assad's forces opened fire on the protesters, which totally declared that there was no more democracy in his country. And he's also refused to negotiate whatsoever with the opposition forces, and has turned a blind eye to the suffering of thousands of his own citizens. So his failure to act and also his blatant action against his citizens has really caused the genocide. Now, according to the Rwandan Tribunal on Genocide by the UN, which charged Edward Karamara and Matthew Ngurumpatse to life in prison for conspiracy to commit genocide, incitement to genocide, complicity in genocide, and other charges relating to crimes against humanity and genocide against the Tutsi population of Rwanda, would apply best to Assad's situation, because Karamara and Ngurumpatse were the leaders of the Rwandan government and directly served as leaders of the genocide and key actors in the genocide. So their punishment, which was life in prison, as I said, would translate to a similar punishment for Assad. However, I believe that the punishments faced by Karamara and Ngurumpatse were too lenient because they caused so much suffering for all of their citizens. And al-Assad should actually receive the death penalty for the severe crimes and for the destruction he caused for his whole country and for thousands of families and people in his country. The other actors that could be held responsible in the Syrian conflict would be Russia and Iran. So at first glance, this doesn't really make sense because they're not actually in Syria. However, as 2 democratic nations, Russia and Iran should respect the will of the Syrian citizens to demonstrate peacefully and should uphold their peaceful protest and their opposition to the government instead of Assad's tyrannical regime. So they should be held accountable for their ignorance in the conflict and their obstruction of other countries, including the US, of actually taking action. So the only similar case that could involve a precedent would also be in the Rwandan Tribunal for Genocide, which would be the media case, which is a very unique case to the Rwandan tribunals, in which heads of media in Rwanda were charged with complicity in genocide for their role in promoting the actions of the government, even though they threatened the actual civilians. So the sentences of these media officials were imprisonment for a range from 32 to 35 years, depending on the person, which wouldn't be appropriate for premiers of Russia and Iran because they didn't directly commit an action or an obstruction of justice like in Syria. However, the countries should face some kind of penalty or some kind of sanction because of their complicity in the Syrian genocide. So the ICC should mandate sanctions or mandate fines to be paid by Russia and Iran because they ignored the suffering of the Syrian people and helped Assad to further his agenda. There are two main things that the international community could do to stop the genocide that's going on in Syria. The first would be to strengthen sanctions that are currently in place by the EU, by other organizations in the international community, including the UN or NATO, which include sanctions on luxury goods that include caviar, truffles, and cigars, wines and spirits, leather goods, tableware, clocks and watches, jewelry, gems and pearls, and luxury vehicles. And the thing that those sanctions do is that they stop Syrian wholesalers, Syrian retailers, and Syrian consumers from buying these things, and the sale of them going to taxes that would ultimately benefit the Assad regime. And the international community could also adopt the EU's other sanctions, which include the sanctions on chemical weapons that stop Bashar al-Assad's regime from making weapons that could be directly used to harm his citizens. The other thing the international community could do to resolve the conflict without ICC action would for the US and other strong democratic nations to take direct military action in Syria. And according to the McCain Institute, the U.S. failure to act so far has really led to the ability for terrorist groups like ISIS and al-Qaeda to take more control of Syria and to really actually inhibit the Assad regime from furthering their objectives. So not only you have Assad causing his genocide, but you have ISIS attacking innocent civilians and destroying holy sites, which really just creates a disaster in the whole area. And however, the Assad regime doesn't have enough power to reclaim areas that are captured by ISIS, nor do they really want to, because ISIS supports the Assad regime in Iran, which poses a threat to America's greatest Middle Eastern ally, which is Israel. So the U.S. has the U.S. should back the Sunni population in Syria in order to help them fight against the oppressive Shia Assad regime and the ISIS soldiers. Now, according to Andrew Tabler, who's a senior fellow in the program on Arab politics at the Washington Institute, and Michael Doran, who's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, Syria isn't defined by only the Sunni and Shia extremes. There remains a moderate middle that could govern and deserves support. So if the U.S. wanted to take action in Syria militarily, they could arm the moderates in order to have them make a real strong democratic government that would last, unlike the Assad regime, which is currently oppressing them. Now, Tabler and Doran have also said that the current situation won't be resolved on its own, and the only way to a solution in the region of Syria and the Levant is to defeat the Jihadistan, which is the control of the area by jihad militant groups like ISIS, through much more assertive U.S. intervention.